It started with a whisper so small, so soft, that it might have gone unheard if not for what came after. "Don't go in there alone tonight." Those were the words the senior housekeeper murmured as the royal maid prepared to tidy Meghan Markle's private quarters. At the time, no one knew why. The Duchess of Sussex was away for an official engagement. The air in the palace was unusually tense, yet strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that hides secrets, thick, breathing secrets that live beneath silk sheets and mahogany floors. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The maid, a woman known among the staff for her precision and loyalty, thought little of it. She'd cleaned every royal bedroom there was, from the Queen's chambers to visiting dignitaries' suites. She was used to discretion, used to silence. But that night, something felt different. You see, there are rules inside royal walls. Rules you don't break, no matter what you find. You never read what's sealed. You never touch what's labeled private. And you never, ever question a royal's belongings. But what happens when private means something dangerous? Now imagine this. You're dusting under a bed, an ordinary routine. But instead of shoes or forgotten slippers, your hand hits plastic. Cold, solid, unmarked plastic bins tucked deep beneath the frame. Strange, right? Royals have custom wardrobes, velvet-lined drawers, climate-controlled storage for jewelry. They don't shove things under beds like university students hiding clutter before inspection. So why would a duchess, a global celebrity with a staff to organize her every item, keep sealed plastic bins where no one could see them? The maid hesitated. She could have ignored it. But curiosity, that dangerous spark, won. And in that moment, a story began. A story buried in silence, shielded by power, and whispered in fear. They say the palace is filled with ghosts of the past, but that night, it wasn't the ghosts that haunted the maid. It was what she found under Meghan Markle's bed. Confidential files, legal labels, a single phrase printed in bold, private, for U.S. counsel only. Why would a royal's bedroom contain American legal paperwork? Why not the palace's own legal team, the centuries-old machinery that guards royal interests? Why was it hidden beneath her bed, not filed, not locked, but concealed? And here's where things get darker. Alongside those folders were items that didn't belong. Unregistered royal artifacts, heirlooms, keepsakes, objects that by every royal protocol should have been catalogued, tagged, and stored within the archives. Yet, here they were, in unmarked containers, undocumented and unseen. The maid froze, because she knew what that meant. In the palace, possession of unregistered artifacts isn't just unusual, it's scandalous. Every royal item, down to the smallest silver spoon, is logged, preserved, insured. So if something wasn't recorded, someone didn't want it traced. Now here's the question that sent shivers through the staff. Were these keepsakes or leverage? See, the Duchess had been under quiet scrutiny long before her public split from the monarchy. Tensions behind the scenes were boiling. Rumors of late-night calls to U.S. advisors, secret letters, confidential discussions far beyond the palace's reach. But no one expected physical proof. Not like this. The maid, frightened but compelled, took a mental snapshot of everything. The documents, the labels, even the placement of the bins. Later that night, she confided in one trusted colleague. Within days, that whisper turned into the quietest storm in royal history. Inside the palace, everything is about discretion. Scandals are suffocated before they breathe. But this discovery was different, because it hinted at something deeper. Not just personal secrecy, but planning, coordination, strategy. The label for U.S. counsel only wasn't just a phrase. It was a declaration. It meant American jurisdiction, American lawyers. Which begged the question, was Meghan Markle already preparing her exit from the royal institution while she was still living inside it? Think about the timing. Publicly, she smiled through royal events, hand in hand with Harry, appearing the perfect duchess. But privately, beneath her bed, were documents pointing across the Atlantic. To California, to her past, to her future. The maid didn't fully grasp it then, but she'd stumbled upon evidence of a plan, one that predated the famous Megxit. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, if you were that maid, what would you have done? Would you have reported it immediately, risking your job, your silence clause, your royal oath? Or would you have walked away, pretending you'd seen nothing? She tried to forget, But how do you forget the sight of sealed files labeled private for U.S. counsel only? How do you ignore the uneasy weight of royal artifacts hidden where no one should have looked? Days turned into weeks, and whispers spread like smoke through the servants' halls. Some said the maid had seen documents involving American real estate transfers. Others swore it was early drafts of legal correspondence, perhaps related to trademarks or ownership rights over the Sussex name. Every rumor added a new layer of fear. Every whisper sharpened the edges of truth. And through it all, Meghan remained poised, perfectly polished, unbothered, smiling on camera, wearing the crown jewels she had access to, dazzling the world in interviews about kindness and compassion. But behind that composure, the palace staff felt the tension rising. Something was shifting. A divide was growing between the Duchess and the royal institution. Meetings became colder. Communications were rerouted. Security tightened around her quarters. And the maid who had stumbled upon the secret? She was quietly reassigned. But royal walls have ears. And those ears started listening closely. The palace hierarchy was built to contain chaos, to keep scandal behind velvet curtains. Yet this discovery felt different, because it wasn't just personal. It hinted at a possible breach of royal protocol, perhaps even legality. So who were the U.S. counsel? Why were files marked for them sitting beneath the bed of a royal duchess in a British palace? And what could possibly be inside them that required such secrecy? Theories began to surface internally. Some thought it involved the couple's impending negotiations with international media companies. Others whispered it was about private estates or legal mechanisms to protect intellectual property, the kind tied to documentaries and brand names. Whatever the truth, one thing became clear. Meghan Markle had been thinking long-term. And whatever she was planning, she wanted it beyond the reach of royal control. This wasn't the image the world saw. The smiling duchess walking alongside the queen, the caring mother, the humanitarian figure. This was something colder, strategic, intentional. But the real shock wasn't just the documents. It was what else those plastic bins contained. Because beneath the papers and files, the maid spotted glimmers, small, ornate items that clearly weren't part of the duchess's personal collection. Tiny boxes of antique jewelry, embroidered handkerchiefs with royal crests, even a faded photograph in a golden frame that the archives later identified as missing from a private collection. These weren't souvenirs. They were historical, priceless, and unregistered. The discovery sent the palace into silent turmoil. Behind closed doors, senior officials began cross-checking archive lists. Some items matched records of things that had been reported misplaced years earlier. Others didn't appear at all, as if they'd been erased from existence. And yet, the entire matter was buried. No public statements, no disciplinary action, just a quiet reorganization and the maid's sudden resignation shortly after. Years later, when she finally spoke, her voice trembling but determined, she described that night in haunting detail. "I wish I'd never looked," she said, "because once I saw what was under that bed, I understood everything that followed. Everything. The tension, the exit, the calculated departure to America, the creation of private companies, the sudden brand deals. It all started with those files." The maid's confession didn't just reopen old wounds, it reframed them. It revealed that the royal rupture may not have been spontaneous at all. It may have been engineered, long before the world even suspected trouble. And perhaps the most haunting part? The palace's silence. Because when asked, senior officials refused to deny that a confidential internal incident report existed. They simply said, "We do not comment on private household matters." Private. There's that word again. Private. For U.S. counsel only. It was the same word that began it all. So as this story unfolds, we'll dive deeper into that night. What was found, who found it, and how the truth was quietly buried. We'll examine the chain of secrecy that wrapped around Meghan's royal quarters like invisible wire. And we'll uncover how one maid's innocent act exposed one of the most carefully concealed chapters in royal history. Because beneath the royal sparkle, there's always dust. And sometimes, that dust hides secrets too powerful to remain buried. But what the maid discovered next, beyond those bins, beyond those files, would not only shake the monarchy, but change the way we understand Meghan Markle's entire royal journey. Because what came next, no one in the palace saw coming. It was supposed to be a quiet night. The kind of night when the palace seemed to sleep. When the ticking of the antique clocks echoed down the marble halls, and the scent of polished wood hung faintly in the air. But inside those still corridors, one woman was wide awake. Her name was never publicly released. The royal aides made sure of that. But to those who worked within those walls, she was known for two things: her diligence and her silence. She'd served through decades of royal transitions, witnessed marriages, funerals, and whispered scandals. But nothing in her long service prepared her for what she was about to see inside the Duchess of Sussex's private suite. At precisely 10:47 p.m., she received the message. A last-minute request for routine inspection and dusting. That phrase alone made her frown. No one ordered a room inspection that late, especially not when the Duchess was due back the next morning. But orders were orders. You don't question a command in the palace, you execute it. She tied her apron, smoothed her uniform, and carried her small toolkit of brushes, dust cloths, and polish. The corridors were dim, only lit by the soft golden glow of antique sconces. Somewhere in the distance, the guard's boots clicked rhythmically against the marble. When she reached the suite, she hesitated at the door. There was something different about the atmosphere. Colder, heavier. The faintest trace of sandalwood perfume lingered, mixed with the sterile scent of sealed air. Meghan's quarters always smelled like curated calm, luxury candles, fresh linen, expensive lotions. But tonight, there was something else. A stiffness, an edge. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. Everything was immaculate. Cushions perfectly aligned, flowers freshly replaced, and the Duchess's personal items neatly arranged on her vanity. But something about that perfection felt unnatural, forced, like someone had cleaned too much, as if they were erasing evidence rather than tidying a room. Still, she began her work, quietly moving from corner to corner. She dusted the side tables, adjusted the curtains, and polished the ornate handles of the dresser. Her eyes landed on a single object out of place, a pearl earring lying on the carpet just beside the bed. She bent down to pick it up, and that's when it happened. Her hand brushed against something solid beneath the bed frame. Smooth plastic, hard edges. At first, she thought it might be a storage box. Royals often had seasonal items stored discreetly. But this was different. The texture was industrial, the kind used for transporting sensitive materials. She knelt lower, pushing aside the bed skirt, and saw them. Two large plastic bins, tightly sealed, unmarked. Her instincts told her to stop, but curiosity whispered louder. She reached out and pulled one forward. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been. The label caught her eye. It was faint, but the words were clear: private, for U.S. counsel only. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't just personal paperwork. Royals didn't keep foreign legal files in their private quarters. All official matters went through the Lord Chamberlain's office or the palace legal team. The only time foreign legal counsel was involved was during international disputes or private estates. But this was different. She froze, her heart hammering. The walls seemed to close in. She knew she shouldn't be looking. She knew that even noticing such things could cost her job, perhaps worse. But the bin, it wasn't locked. Her trembling fingers lifted the lid slightly, just enough to see. Inside were folders, dozens of them, all neatly arranged, labeled in black ink. Some were stamped with legal logos from American firms. She saw California addresses. She saw one tab labeled Trademark Registration, another marked Financial Retainers. But then came the shock, a folder titled Royal Intellectual Property, Sussex Brand Draft. She blinked. Could it be possible? At that time, Meghan and Harry were still full-time working royals. They had royal duties, royal privileges, and royal funding. No one inside the institution would have dared to draft or discuss monetizing the royal titles. Yet here, hidden beneath the bed, were the early blueprints for exactly that. The maid felt a chill run through her. She glanced around the room. The gleaming vanity, the folded dresses, the photograph of Harry smiling from a gold frame. Everything looked so perfect, so innocent. But this wasn't the kind of perfection the palace approved. And then she noticed something else. Beneath the folders were velvet pouches. Small, delicate, sealed with golden ties. She hesitated, then lifted one carefully. The weight was unmistakable, jewelry. Inside, she glimpsed a bracelet, glittering faintly in the dim light. But not just any bracelet. It bore a royal crest. She knew that emblem. It was part of a collection kept in the royal archives, one that had been missing for months. Her breath caught in her throat. She quickly replaced everything exactly as she found it, slid the bin back under the bed, and backed away. Her hands were shaking so violently that she had to clutch the side of the dresser just to steady herself. But her eyes kept drifting back to the bed, to those sealed bins, to that one phrase echoing in her mind, "Private, for U.S. counsel only." Something was deeply wrong. By the time she left the room, her uniform clung to her with cold sweat. She locked the door behind her, as protocol demanded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The palace at night has a way of amplifying silence. Every creak, every breath feels like a confession. She walked quickly down the hall, her mind racing. Should she report it? Should she stay quiet? Down in the servants' quarters, she sat at the small metal table reserved for late-night staff. Her colleague, an older woman who had been there since Princess Diana's time, noticed her trembling. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said softly. The maid didn't answer. She couldn't. The words were trapped between loyalty and fear. Hours later, unable to sleep, she scribbled a note in her personal journal, a habit she'd kept since her first day of service. She described the bin, the labels, and her confusion. She didn't name Meghan. She didn't accuse. She simply wrote, "Found something strange. Feels wrong." That entry would later become evidence, a timestamp that aligned perfectly with the night the discovery was made. But for now, it was just a secret between her and the shadows. The following morning, Meghan returned from her engagement in London. Witnesses say she seemed unusually quiet. She skipped her usual chat with staff. Instead, she walked straight to her quarters. The maid wasn't assigned there that day, but another attendant swore she heard movement, the sound of boxes being dragged, the click of a lock, the faint rustle of paper. Within an hour, the Duchess called for a private meeting with her personal assistant. The door stayed closed for nearly 3 hours. Later that evening, the bins were gone. When the maid returned to duty the next week, she noticed the change immediately. The bed had been replaced. The area under it was empty, and a new rule was posted quietly in the service corridor. All private quarters are to be accessed only with senior authorization. She didn't need to ask why. She already knew. Because in royal households, when rules suddenly change, it means someone has discovered something they shouldn't have. The tension in the air was palpable. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. The maid could feel the shift, the quiet glances, the coded instructions, the veiled reminders about discretion. But the secret had already spread. One whisper became 2, then 10. "There were files," someone said. "American files." "She's planning something," another replied. And somewhere deep inside the palace, the gears of control began to turn. Investigators were quietly dispatched to review storage procedures. Every staff member connected to Meghan's household was discreetly questioned, but no one dared mention the bins. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, everything had changed. The maid went back to her normal duties, but every time she passed Meghan's door, she felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't guilt, it was dread, because she knew she had seen something that could destroy a royal reputation. Weeks later, she overheard something that made her blood run cold. A senior aide muttered to another, "We found traces, but one bin's missing. One bin. Gone." That was when she realized this wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about power, the kind of power that comes from knowing what others shouldn't. And somewhere between those sealed files and that missing bin lay the story that would one day tear the royal family apart. Because what she found under that bed was only the beginning. The real storm was still coming, and when it hit, the palace would never be the same again. But before the world learned about those bins, something even stranger happened inside those royal walls. Something that made the staff realize the Duchess's secrets were far from over. Because the next discovery didn't just expose documents. It exposed intent. And it all started with those words, "Private, for U.S. counsel only." But what the palace discovered after that label, what they uncovered hidden beneath the next layer, would rewrite everything the monarchy thought it knew about loyalty, legality, and the meaning of being royal. And no one, not even the Queen herself, saw it coming. The words burned into her mind like an echo she couldn't silence. "Private, for U.S. counsel only." The maid had tried to move on. tried to forget that forbidden glimpse under the Duchess's bed. But how do you forget something that makes no sense? American legal files in a royal suite. California law firm letterheads beside the crest of the British monarchy. It didn't add up. Not then. Not now. Then, one afternoon, the maid witnessed something that confirmed her worst fears. She was delivering linens to the Duchess's quarters when she saw Meghan's assistant, a young woman always carrying multiple phones, walking briskly down the hallway, clutching a brown envelope. Behind her trailed a suited man with a leather briefcase. He wasn't palace staff. He wasn't British. His accent, when he spoke, was unmistakably American. They entered Meghan's private room without knocking. The door shut, and for the next 2 hours, the hallway outside was off limits. Security stood stationed at both ends, pretending it was a maintenance lockdown. But no maintenance workers came. When the doors finally reopened, the assistant emerged looking pale. The man followed, his expression unreadable, clutching the same briefcase, but thicker, stuffed. Within days, palace legal advisors started meeting behind closed doors, and word spread that certain documents of concern had been removed from the royal premises by third-party contractors. It was an elegant way of saying, someone smuggled something out. From that point, everything spiraled. Quietly, strategically, but unmistakably. Meghan's household was suddenly under administrative review. Staff rotations increased. Several long-serving maids were reassigned without explanation. Even her personal chef was replaced. Yet Meghan herself seemed calm, detached even, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She walked the palace halls with poise, her head high, as though the chaos didn't touch her. To the world, she was radiant, attending charity events, smiling for cameras. But inside the palace, whispers grew louder. She's preparing for something, one guard muttered. A move, a shift, and then came the discovery that confirmed everyone's suspicions. During one of the internal audits, an archivist stumbled upon a folder that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't under Meghan's name. It was coded, labeled only M&H Transition Plan. Inside were memos about property relocation, tax implications, and digital brand protection, all dated before the official decision to step back was made public. In other words, the plan was already in motion. It was never impulsive. It was premeditated. Every smiling photo, every public appearance, every private struggle, all of it seemed, in hindsight, like pieces of a script leading to one carefully orchestrated finale. Freedom from the institution, with her image intact and her brand secured. And those files, the ones labeled private, for U.S. counsel only, were the foundation. The maid didn't know all this until much later. But she felt it. She sensed the walls closing in, the change in tone when her supervisors spoke about the Duchess. Gone was the polite admiration. In its place came an uneasy respect, the kind you give someone who might be dangerous if provoked. Late one night, while organizing the laundry room, she overheard the senior housekeeper mutter under her breath, "She's playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers." That line stuck with her, because that was exactly what it felt like, a game of strategy. Each move calculated, each smile rehearsed, each file, each bin, a step toward a destination only Meghan understood. And just when the palace thought it had contained the situation, something unexpected surfaced. One of the audit officers noticed that several of the confidential legal files listed in the internal report were missing from the archives. Vanished. When asked about them, Meghan's staff claimed ignorance. But the timestamps told a different story. Those files were last logged in her quarters the night before her final engagement as a working royal. Coincidence? Maybe. But in the palace, coincidence doesn't exist. From that moment on, the situation shifted from curiosity to crisis. The Queen was briefed, quietly, privately. She said little. Just nodded, sipped her tea, and whispered, "Handle it with grace." But beneath that calm, the message was clear. This was a matter of containment. Nothing leaks. Nothing spreads. Except, of course, it already had. Because while the palace tried to bury the story, one tabloid editor received an anonymous message containing 2 photographs, low quality, slightly blurred, but unmistakable. One showed a folder labeled for U.S. counsel only. The other showed a gloved hand lifting the corner of a plastic bin under a royal bed. The images were never published. The editor received a phone call the next morning. No threats, no bribes, just a quiet, "Consider your career." The photos vanished from circulation. The source was never identified. But within the palace, panic erupted. Someone had proof. Someone had seen the same thing the maid saw. And if that proof ever went public, it wouldn't just embarrass the monarchy, it could dismantle it. Because it would expose the crown's inability to control one of its own. The maid, meanwhile, was dismissed quietly. She was given severance, an NDA, and a reference letter praising her years of impeccable service. But before she left, she made one small photocopy, of her journal entry from that night. She folded it into a plain envelope and mailed it to her sister in Devon. She told her, "If anything happens to me, this is my truth." Years later, when she finally broke her silence, that very note became her protection, her shield against accusations, her proof of what she saw. But the palace still insists those files were never real, that no such bin existed, that no investigation took place. So who's telling the truth? The maid who lost everything? Or the institution that silences anyone who strays from the script? And if those files really were gone, where did they go? Because months later, one of the labels, that same private, for U.S. Counsel only, resurfaced. Not in London, not in Windsor, but halfway across the world, in Montecito. And the way it was discovered would leave even the most loyal royal watchers speechless. Because what turned up next didn't just confirm the maid's story. It suggested that Meghan hadn't just hidden documents. She'd hidden something far more dangerous. Something that, if true, could redefine what the entire royal exit was really about. But what was in those bins? And how did one end up missing? The answer would come soon enough, when the investigation led straight to the palace's hidden storage room. And what they found there, no one was prepared to see. It was supposed to be over. The palace had shut it down. The staff were silenced. The maid was gone. And yet, something about the whole affair wouldn't rest. It lingered, like a faint scent of perfume after someone has left the room. The kind of presence you can't see, but can't ignore either. Because no matter how tightly the palace tried to close the lid on the story, one of those bins had gone missing. Weeks after Meghan and Harry's official departure was announced, a quiet panic rippled through the palace archives. It began innocently, a standard post-departure inventory. Every royal residence was undergoing inspection, ensuring nothing of historical or financial significance had been misplaced. Normally, these checks were routine, procedural, boring. But this one wasn't. When the archivist in charge opened the Duchess's personal storage record, something didn't add up. Each royal's belongings are catalogued meticulously, down to the last ribbon and handwritten note. But several items from the Duchess's list were unaccounted for. Small things at first, personal gifts, private correspondence. Then, something bigger, several objects classified as archival sensitive. In other words, royal property. And alongside that missing inventory was a note, dated weeks before Meghan and Harry's final day as working royals. It reads simply, "Transferred for private safekeeping. Verified, MP." Except, there was no record of who MP was. That's when the whispers started again. The staff called it the vault rumor. Some said Meghan had transported personal containers to Canada weeks before the announcement. Others claimed the bins were hidden temporarily in one of the lesser-used palace storage rooms, waiting to be retrieved. A few even believed she'd arranged private couriers to ship specific items to the U.S. But the strangest part? There were conflicting records, duplicates, overlapping entries, missing signatures. As if someone inside the palace had tampered with the logs. That's when a young assistant archivist, eager to prove herself, decided to investigate further. Her name, like the maid's, remains undisclosed in every official version of this story. But insiders say she was one of the few who dared to question the discrepancies. And what she found, buried in the lowest sublevel of the palace archives, would unravel the myth of royal order. It was early evening when she discovered the door, a side entrance to an unused storage wing that hadn't been accessed in months. The lock was ordinary, but the air inside smelled wrong. Damp, dusty, forgotten. She flicked on her flashlight and stepped inside. The light cut through rows of old trunks, furniture, paintings draped in sheets. All the things the monarchy had deemed too old, too political, or too awkward to display. It was history in exile. And there, Tucked away behind a stack of vintage luggage, she saw them. 2 large plastic bins. She knew immediately what she was looking at. The dimensions matched the reports. Unmarked, opaque, sealed tight. Her hands trembled as she approached. One had a faded sticker, the ghost of a label, peeled but still faintly legible. Private, for U.S. Counsel only. Her heart started pounding. This wasn't just royal storage. This was the missing evidence. She knelt down, brushing away the dust. Both bins were covered in a thin layer of grime, meaning they'd been there for some time. But the seals were intact. No tampering, no cracks. At that moment, she had 2 choices: follow the rules or follow her instincts. Rules said she should report it immediately, but instincts told her if she did, those bins would vanish again. So, quietly, she took out her phone and snapped 3 photos. That single act, one click in the dark, would later become one of the most controversial pieces of digital evidence in royal history. Because when she opened the first bin, she saw what the maid had described. Stacks of folders, each one labeled in the same meticulous handwriting. U.S. legal terminology, case references, signatures. There were memos referencing corporate restructuring, non-disclosure alignment, and media representation protocols. She didn't fully understand what it meant, but one thing was clear: these weren't British documents. They were American, written for a jurisdiction outside the monarchy's reach. Then came the second bin. Inside were objects, dozens of them, wrapped in silk, tucked in pouches, carefully protected. At first glance, they looked like personal items. But as she unwrapped one after another, her breath caught. A golden locket engraved with royal insignia. A handwritten letter from a long-deceased relative of the Queen. A brooch that had appeared in an archival photograph from the 1950s and had been reported missing for years. Every item inside that bin was part of royal history. And yet, none of them were listed in the official database. These weren't just souvenirs. They were relics. And whoever had collected them had done it quietly, deliberately, and without authorization. The archivist didn't sleep that night. She printed the photos, sealed them in an envelope, and slipped them into her desk drawer. The next morning, she went straight to her supervisor, a man known for his loyalty to the palace. He listened, pale-faced, then took the envelope and said, "You've done your duty." By the next day, the bins were gone. No record of removal. No log. No explanation. When she asked about it, her supervisor avoided her eyes. "Best not to get involved," he said quietly. "You did the right thing. Now let it go." But she couldn't, because later that week, a rumor began to circulate among security staff. One of the bins had been sent abroad for verification. Another had been redirected to a private facility near Windsor. Yet no one could confirm either claim. It was as if the bins had split, like the truth itself, each part vanishing into its own shadow. And that's when the second confession surfaced. A retired palace investigator, one of the few who handled internal audits, broke his silence in a private conversation years later. He described being summoned one night to review materials of concern found in private quarters. He said the items were non-compliant with standard royal storage, and that some bore signs of potential evidence tampering. When asked who authorized his involvement, he said, "I never knew. The order came from above, much higher than the usual channels." He described the discovery of unregistered artifacts, objects whose absence had quietly troubled the archives for years. He spoke of how they were catalogued briefly, then removed under external review. And when pressed about the files labeled for U.S. Counsel, his response was chilling. They weren't just legal documents. They were part of a contingency plan. A contingency plan for what? He refused to elaborate. But insiders claimed the plan outlined legal steps to preserve the Duchess's rights to her name, her image, and potentially, her child's privacy. All under American law. If that were true, it would mean Meghan wasn't just preparing to leave. She was preparing to protect herself from the monarchy's reach. And perhaps that's why those bins were hidden. Not out of greed, not out of malice, but out of strategy. Still, one question remained. Why include the royal artifacts? Some said it was sentiment. Others, symbolism. A quiet statement of independence, taking pieces of history to carry into a new life. But the palace saw it differently. To them, it was theft, betrayal, a violation of everything the monarchy stood for. That's when the story took its darkest turn. Months after the bins vanished, a photograph surfaced online. A faint image from a California news segment showing Meghan during a video interview. On the shelf behind her sat a small golden frame, identical to one listed among the unregistered artifacts. The resemblance was uncanny. The design unique to a royal jeweler who had produced only 3 of its kind, all originally kept in the palace archives. Royal watchers noticed immediately. They froze the frame, zoomed in, compared it with historic photos. The match was nearly perfect. The palace refused to comment. The clip was quietly removed days later. But by then, the damage was done. The narrative had shifted from missing files to missing heirlooms. And suddenly, the story wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about legacy. The kind of legacy that doesn't just belong to a person, but to an entire dynasty. And if the palace couldn't account for those artifacts, what else had slipped through its hands? The Maid's original account, once dismissed as rumor, suddenly seemed prophetic. Everything she described under that bed was real. The bins existed. The files existed. The artifacts existed. The only mystery now was where they had gone, and who still had them. Because if even one of those bins made it out of royal custody, it meant secrets far bigger than lost jewelry were at stake. And according to one insider, that missing bin didn't vanish at all. It was moved to somewhere the palace couldn't touch. And what was inside it? Well, that's where this story takes its most shocking turn. Because the next revelation wasn't about royal objects or American files. It was about something human, something intimate, something that would challenge the very story the world believed about Meghan Markle's time in the royal family. And when it finally came to light, even the most loyal defenders couldn't deny what it meant. But that's a revelation for the next chapter. Because when investigators traced the chain of custody for that missing bin, the names, the signatures, the cover stories, they discovered something that changed everything. Something that made the palace realize that what was under the bed was never supposed to be found. Not by a maid, not by an archivist, not by anyone. And when they finally uncovered where that bin went and what it contained, it exposed not just a secret, but a strategy years in the making. A strategy that started in the palace, but ended halfway across the world. The palace does not panic easily. It's built, quite literally, to absorb chaos, centuries of scandal, whispered affairs, political missteps, and family disputes. The walls of Buckingham have seen everything: divorces, abdications, betrayals, deaths. Yet through it all, the monarchy stands, smiling, waving, unshaken. But this time was different. The moment the missing bin was confirmed, a quiet storm brewed behind those immaculate facades. It began with subtle signals, phone calls after midnight, private notes passed through couriers, and an emergency meeting convened without any public record. No one said the word bin. Not once. They referred to it as the item. In those circles, language is everything. A single misplaced word can send reporters swarming, or worse, alert the wrong ears. So instead of missing bin, it became the item of concern. Instead of investigation, it was review of internal order. The palace spoke in code, and the deeper the panic grew, the softer their words became. But actions spoke loudly. Security sweeps intensified. Staff were interrogated discreetly, not with shouting or threats, but with the cold politeness of a monarchy protecting itself. One by one, members of Meghan's former staff were questioned. Where did the bins go? Who had access? Who signed the transfer slip marked MP? No one answered. Or perhaps they did, but not truthfully. Because every time the investigation circled back toward Meghan's private quarters, the paper trail dissolved. Emails deleted. Logs overwritten. Authorizations mysteriously missing signatures. It was as if someone inside the system was erasing the evidence as quickly as it was discovered. The Queen's private secretary, known for his stoic calm, reportedly told aides, "We are managing a situation of considerable delicacy." That was palace code for a disaster we cannot afford to admit exists. Meanwhile, Harry seemed oblivious to the growing panic. Or maybe he wasn't. Some insiders later claimed he noticed changes. The whispers, the late-night calls, the tension. But Meghan told him it was noise. Background politics. The kind of palace nonsense that always flared up when a woman stepped out of line. It was an effective explanation, one that aligned with his deepest frustrations about the institution. And so he looked away. But not everyone did. Behind the polished doors of the royal household offices, The communications team was already on high alert. They knew how this could look if it ever leaked. A duchess accused of hiding unregistered artifacts and legal files from U.S. attorneys. It would be catastrophic, not just for Meghan, but for the monarchy itself. Because scandals involving loss of royal property aren't like affairs or feuds. They raise legal questions, ownership questions, historical questions, and questions about how much control the monarchy truly has over its own narrative. The head of royal communications drafted multiple contingency statements, each more vague than the last. Certain personal items belonging to the Duchess have been relocated. No royal artifacts are missing, and all records remain intact. The palace does not comment on private family matters. That last one became the official line, the shield behind which they could hide everything. But the silence didn't erase the fear, because deep down, everyone inside those walls knew the truth. If those bins contained what they suspected, and if even one piece of evidence escaped to the public, it could unravel years of carefully managed image work. The Queen herself was briefed, quietly, privately, as she sipped her afternoon tea. She listened without visible reaction, her expression unreadable. When the explanation ended, she simply set her cup down and said, "See that it is handled." And that was that. No outrage, no theatrics, just royal efficiency, centuries of conditioning to hide emotion behind ceremony. But the command was clear. Handle it. Within hours, the palace machine began to move. A small internal task force was formed under the guise of inventory reconciliation. Trusted security personnel were reassigned to track shipping logs, cross-reference flight manifests, and quietly interview any contractors who had worked in the Duchess's quarters during the final weeks of her stay. The goal wasn't justice. It was control. Because if there's one thing the monarchy cannot tolerate, it's losing control of its story. The investigators worked quickly. Within days, they uncovered something that raised eyebrows across every floor of the palace. A pattern. Multiple private shipments had been dispatched to the United States in the months leading up to Meghan's departure. All under coded names, none directly tied to the Duchess, but easily traceable to her personal staff. The package's contents were listed as private media equipment and personal correspondence. But the insurance values were unusually high, tens of thousands of pounds per container. That was when the palace realized this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been moving sensitive materials for months, right under their noses. The tension between departments grew unbearable. The communications team blamed the legal office. The legal office blamed logistics. Logistics blamed the private secretaries. Everyone was covering themselves. And through it all, Meghan remained publicly radiant. She appeared in flawless photographs, giving poised interviews about female empowerment, smiling beside Harry as they delivered speeches about kindness and courage. The contrast was staggering. While the world saw compassion, the palace felt cornered. Even Prince William reportedly lost patience. During a private meeting, he allegedly confronted senior aides, demanding to know how the situation had been allowed to spiral out of control. "We can't have this hanging over us," he was quoted as saying. "It's not just about her. It's about the institution." And that's when the true panic began. Because a royal institution built on secrecy cannot withstand the threat of exposure. Behind closed doors, contingency plans multiplied. Lawyers drafted potential responses in case the media ever caught wind of the story. The Queen's advisors ordered stricter information lockdowns. Even senior family members were told to avoid discussing Meghan at public engagements. Yet despite all that, small cracks began to form. A few trusted staff, disgusted by what they saw as hypocrisy, started whispering. One of them leaked fragments of information to a journalist known for covering royal controversies. It wasn't much, just a tip, but it was enough. The journalist reached out to palace sources, hinting that she knew about a lost container of personal items and unregistered heirlooms. Within hours, her editor received a polite but firm phone call. "Cease inquiry immediately." The next day, she posted a vague tweet. Sometimes silence says everything. It was deleted within minutes. The palace thought it had contained the threat, but it hadn't. Because the journalist had already started digging elsewhere, across the Atlantic. And that's where the story takes a darker turn. Because in California, where privacy laws shield the powerful, traces of those same bins began surfacing, quietly, discreetly, in private collections and insurance registries. One shipment matched the dimensions of the missing bin from the palace inventory. Another contained documents marked private legal material protected. Coincidence? Or confirmation? The palace didn't know yet, but they were terrified to find out. By now, senior aides were desperate to put the issue to rest. They decided to issue one final internal directive: no further inquiries into the matter. Staff were told to destroy any duplicates of reports, to erase digital correspondence, and to forget any information not formally documented. But you can't erase human memory, and you certainly can't silence everyone. Because among the remaining staff who had been part of those midnight cleanups, the shifting, the shredding, the hiding, one couldn't bear the guilt. A middle-aged aide who had served under 3 royal administrations quietly reached out to someone she trusted, Lady Colin Campbell. Lady C, the outspoken royal commentator, had always been regarded as a dangerous voice. Unpredictable, unfiltered, unafraid. But she had connections, deep ones. And when that aide told her about the missing bin, the panic, and the hush-hush cover-up, Lady C didn't hesitate. She began to investigate. And the details she uncovered, the files, the items, the contradictions, would later explode in one of her most talked-about interviews. But before Lady C could reveal what she knew, another piece of the puzzle emerged. Because while the palace was busy silencing its insiders, someone else was already preparing to speak. The maid. The same woman who had found the bins in the first place. And her confession would reignite the entire storm. Bigger, louder, and far more dangerous than before. Because this time, she wasn't whispering. She was telling her story in full. And when she did, her words didn't just expose a royal secret. They exposed a royal fear. The fear that maybe, just maybe, the institution that once prided itself on order and control had finally met someone who outplayed it at its own game. But what the maid revealed in her confession would shake the monarchy to its core. Because she hadn't just seen what was under that bed, she'd seen what was inside the second envelope. And what that envelope contained would change everything. It started quietly, like most palace storms do. A rumor whispered in the shadows of the staff corridors. A conversation cut short when footsteps approached. Then, almost overnight, the air inside Buckingham changed. Thicker, tense, electric. Something had escaped. Not a physical object this time, but a story. The maid who had vanished after her resignation, the same one who had discovered those bins under Meghan's bed, was back. Not inside the palace, but in the headlines of a small, independent news outlet based far from London's mainstream press. Her name wasn't mentioned. Her face was blurred. But her words were unmistakable. She described finding items beneath a royal bed that did not belong there. She spoke of documents labeled for foreign legal counsel. She hinted at a sense of dread, as though the walls themselves knew what I'd seen. She didn't name Meghan. She didn't name the palace. But she didn't have to. Everyone knew. Within hours, the article was picked up by a foreign tabloid, one that specialized in stories the British press wouldn't dare print. The headline was explosive. Royal employee claims she found secret American legal files under Duchess's bed. The story spread like wildfire online. Social media lit up. Conspiracy accounts, royal watchers, ex-staffers. Everyone had something to say. But here's the twist. Within 48 hours, the story vanished. Every link, every repost, every trace of the article, gone. Even web archives couldn't find it. To the public, it was as if it never existed. But inside the palace, that erasure confirmed the unthinkable. Someone powerful had intervened. And that's when the panic truly began. Because if the maid had spoken once, she could speak again. And this time, she might not stop at vague hints. She might reveal names, dates, locations. She might describe exactly what those bins contained. The palace couldn't allow that. Within days, legal representatives began circulating confidentiality warnings to former staff, thinly disguised as reminders of existing agreements. Phones were confiscated. NDAs were reinforced. Even the cleaning staff were suddenly bound by updated privacy clauses. It was damage control on a royal scale. But while the palace was tightening its grip, the internet was doing the opposite. Amateur sleuths had already saved screenshots of the original article. They compared timestamps, cross-referenced details, and began forming their own conclusions. A Reddit thread exploded overnight. Meghan's Hidden Bins, the real story? It featured blurry images, alleged insider accounts, even diagrams of the royal suite showing where the bins might have been found. Of course, half of it was wild speculation. But buried among the chaos were fragments of truth, details so precise, only someone close to the story could have known them. One user posted a line that stood out. There were 2 bins. One stayed, one left. The one that left never came back. That comment was deleted minutes later. But by then, the palace couldn't stop what had already begun, a digital echo chamber where every whisper became gospel. And in the middle of it all, the maid was nowhere to be found. Some said she'd been paid off. Others claimed she was living abroad under a new name. But there was another theory, one whispered by those who had seen too much. They said she'd been contacted by someone from California, a woman who claimed she wanted to understand what had been found. Now, whether that contact was Meghan herself, a representative, or someone linked to her legal team, no one knew for sure. But whatever the truth, one thing was clear. The maid's story had crossed the ocean. And across that ocean, something else was stirring. In Montecito, Meghan was preparing for one of her first major media appearances since stepping down from royal duties. A glowing feature meant to highlight her new life, new mission, and new beginnings. But during that interview, something caught viewers' eyes, a small detail no one was supposed to notice. On a shelf behind Meghan sat a neatly arranged row of books, a vase of white roses, and a stack of folders. The camera only caught them for a second, but the label on the top folder was visible. 3 words, blurred but still readable, for U.S. Counsel. Social media exploded again. Did anyone else see that? One user posted on X, "She has the same folders from the Maid story." Within hours, clips of the interview were being dissected frame by frame. Some argued it was coincidence, that any legal professional might have documents labeled counsel. Others weren't so sure, because the timing was uncanny. The leak, the article's disappearance, and now a visual reminder, intentional or not, that those documents still existed. Inside the palace, phones rang nonstop. Advisors scrambled to assess the damage. Should they issue a denial? Ignore it? Acknowledge it quietly? Ultimately, they did what they always do. Nothing. Silence. Because denial could invite proof. And proof was the last thing they wanted. But silence didn't stop the speculation. It only fed it. And behind that silence, a new layer of intrigue emerged, one involving the press itself. A journalist from the foreign outlet that first published the Maid's story later revealed, under anonymity, that they'd received a legal takedown request from a UK-based firm acting on behalf of a royal entity. The request cited defamation by implication and invasion of personal privacy. Translation: shut it down. But here's what's interesting. The journalist claimed that within 24 hours of the takedown, their email server was hit with an unusual surge of deletion commands. Files vanished. Their backup drive was corrupted. Someone, somewhere, was wiping traces clean. And yet, they missed one. One attachment survived, a PDF of the original article draft. In it, the maid's description of the files was more detailed than whatever made it online. She'd mentioned seeing dates on the folders, dates that predated Meghan and Harry's official departure by almost a year. That single detail changed everything. It meant that whatever was in those files wasn't reactionary planning. It wasn't a desperate exit strategy. It was premeditated. And if true, it painted a chilling picture. Meghan Markle may have been plotting her royal departure long before anyone even suspected it. The public would never see that draft. The journalist, fearing legal repercussions, disappeared from social media soon after. But the PDF circulated quietly among small online circles. Leaked, re-uploaded, archived, hidden again. You can erase a file, but not a rumor. Meanwhile, in London, the royal aides faced an impossible question. How do you stop a ghost? The story had no official witness, no visible source, no single thread to pull. It was everywhere and nowhere, living online, whispered in the press, speculated in private dinner parties. And then came the next twist. 3 weeks after the takedown, a package arrived at a small law firm in London. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the corner of a royal bedroom, a bed partially visible, and beneath it, the faint outline of a plastic bin. No label this time. But next to it, lying on the floor, was a folded envelope. The words on it were just legible enough to read. For Council Review, California. The photo was old, possibly taken the night the maid first discovered the bins. Experts later speculated it had been snapped in haste, likely by someone in uniform. The law firm immediately turned the photo over to palace legal representatives. Within days, the building's CCTV footage was mysteriously erased. The palace called it a hoax. But the timing, again, was too precise. Because only 2 days later, that same maid, the woman who had vanished, made contact with a journalist again. This time, through a lawyer. Her message was short. They found me once. They won't find me again. But I still have what they missed. That was all she said. No more, no less. And with that, she disappeared, truly this time. The palace went silent. The press moved on. The bins, the files, the maid, all faded back into rumor. But for those who knew how the royal machine operated, that silence was confirmation enough. Something real had been found under that bed. Something important enough to erase, destroy, or bury at any cost. And yet, not everything had been buried. Because months later, a new name surfaced, someone who had worked in the palace archives, someone who had seen what was inside those bins. And she was ready to talk. What she revealed would not only validate the maid's confession, it would expose how deep the palace's cover-up truly went. And the secret she uncovered inside those bins? It wasn't just legal. It was personal. Painfully, dangerously personal. And it involved something, or someone, the palace never wanted the world to know about. There's a moment, somewhere between disbelief and realization, when the truth stops feeling like a rumor and starts feeling like a revelation. That's where the palace found itself after the maid's second disappearance. They didn't have the bins. They didn't have the files. But they did have clues, scattered fragments pointing to one unmistakable place, California. It wasn't just coincidence. It was connection. Every lead, every whisper, every unexplained invoice seemed to orbit around the same sun. A cluster of American law firms, media companies, and private consultants whose names began appearing again and again in royal correspondence. The words U.S. Counsel weren't just a label anymore. They were a breadcrumb trail. And when investigators started following it, quietly, off the record, under layers of secrecy, they discovered something far more intricate than they'd imagined. This wasn't the work of a reckless royal caught hoarding secrets. It was the architecture of an exit, a plan that stretched from London to Los Angeles, with every detail meticulously prepared long before anyone uttered the word Megxit. The first clue came from a set of emails that had survived the palace purge. They weren't official, they were personal, written between assistants. One note, buried deep within the archives, carried a chilling line. Confirm California Council readiness before December. M will handle direct communication. The date? October, nearly a full year before Meghan and Harry announced they were stepping down. That was when everything changed. The palace realized Meghan hadn't been reacting to the pressures of royal life. She had been anticipating them. She was planning her future while still playing her royal role. And when you look closely, the signs had always been there. The subtle shift in her wardrobe from traditional royal tailoring to sleek Hollywood minimalism. The quiet meetings with American agents under the pretense of charity partnerships. The introduction of legal counsel specializing in brand protection, not something any working royal should need. Even her language in interviews began to change. She stopped saying we and started saying I. She talked less about the royal family and more about my platform. It wasn't rebellion. It was preparation. Inside the palace, the discovery sent shockwaves. Senior advisors convened behind closed doors. One of them reportedly said, "She was never playing our game. She was building her own." And he was right. Because when the investigators began connecting the dots, they uncovered an entire network. Lawyers, PR executives, and consultants, all quietly working on what they internally referred to as the transition. The transition wasn't about escape. It was about transformation. It outlined everything: timelines for relocation, strategies for legal independence, potential revenue sources, intellectual property ownership, and even trademark filings. All drafted while Meghan was still appearing at royal events, smiling in pastel coats beside the Queen. Some of the documents were chillingly precise. One outlined steps for detaching royal titles from institutional oversight while preserving brand value. Another listed projected earnings for future media collaborations under private ownership. To anyone outside the palace, that might sound like smart business. But inside Buckingham, it was treasonous. Because the monarchy isn't a business, it's an institution. Its members don't own their titles, they embody them. The royal crest isn't a trademark. It's an inheritance. But in Meghan's new world, everything was intellectual property. And that's where the California connection became undeniable. Investigators found correspondence between one of Meghan's legal representatives in London and a high-profile Los Angeles attorney known for handling celebrity image rights and media contracts. The two exchanged documents referencing sovereign image clauses, territorial naming limitations, and global broadcast agreements. In other words, how to use royal identity legally, without royal permission. When the palace saw that phrase, territorial naming limitations, they knew exactly what it meant.